I was the sound recordist on the halyard reach, and I want to say that up front because everyone assumes I was a scientist. I wasn't. I carried boom poles and hydrophone rigs and a case of foam windscreens that never dried out in that climate. My job was to make sure that when the survey team said something important, it survived the tape. That's all. I was not there to discover anything. I was there to make sure nothing was lost. We were anchored off the sunken terraces of Ilmara, on the flooded shelf of a moon called Corving, cataloging what was left of a civilization that had gone under the water 4,000 years before anyone with hands like ours arrived to look at the wreckage. The terraces had been a city once. Now they were shapes under green water, visible only at low tide, when the sea pulled back far enough to show staircases leading down into nothing. The survey team catalogued everything twice, once by sonar, once by a diver with a slate, and I recorded the ambient sound of each site for the archive, because someone decided future generations should be able to hear what the wreckage sounded like even if they could never touch it. Mostly that meant water moving over stone, and once memorably, a colony of shelled things that clicked in 3/4 time and set the whole crew laughing over the playback that night. We found her on the 9th day, in a flooded chamber the survey team had already logged as empty. She was sitting very still in 3 feet of standing water, knees drawn up, skin the gray-green of old copper, gill slits along her throat closed tight the way I later learned meant fear. The team's xenologist wanted to sedate her for transport. I was the only one already crouched at her eye level, holding my boom pole like an idiot, when she looked straight at me and made a sound. It wasn't language, not in any form our translators could parse. It was closer to a held breath let out slow. But I had a live mic pointed at her, and I recorded it, because that was my job, and because something in me did not want that sound to happen only once and vanish. Command decided she was the last of them. 4,000 years of a drowned people, and she was what remained, an old woman, by whatever accounting her body kept, alone in a chamber she had likely chosen because the water there stayed still. The xenologist wanted 3 weeks of study before any transport decision. I was assigned to keep recording her daily, on the theory that ambient audio might eventually resolve into a communicable structure. I want to be clear, I was bad at my actual assignment. I never built her a vocabulary. I never mapped a syntax. What I did was show up every morning with the same rig, sit at the same distance, and let her get used to the sound of me arriving before I made her get used to anything else. I stopped bringing anyone with me after the 3rd day, because the xenologist's presence made her gills clamp shut for an hour afterward, and I couldn't see the sense in gathering data from a woman too frightened to breathe properly. I logged that as a scheduling decision. Nobody above me asked hard enough to make me explain it as anything else. After the 1st week, her gills stopped closing when I came in. After the 2nd, she started making the same 3-note sound whenever I set my case down, like she'd noticed it was always the same case, arriving at the same hour, in the same low light through the chamber's cracked ceiling stone. I learned the small things without meaning to. She preferred the tide at its lowest, when the water in the chamber sat calm around her knees instead of moving. She flinched at sudden bright light but not at my voice, no matter how much I talked, which I did constantly, mostly to fill the silence and partly because some instinct told me a voice in the room mattered more than what the voice was saying. On the 14th day she reached out and touched the boom pole, then my hand, then pressed something small and cold into my palm and closed my fingers around it herself. It was a disc of oxidized copper on a braided cord, worn soft with age, engraved on one face with a short line of her people's script, 5 characters, none of which our linguists had cracked. She said something when she gave it to me, not the 3-note sound. A different one, longer, quieter, said only once. I recorded that too. Of course I did. It's the only clean recording of her voice we ever got where she wasn't reacting to something happening to her, the only time she was the one doing something to us. The xenologist wanted the tag sent to the lab in the capital for material analysis before I was even allowed to log it as personal effects. I fought that harder than I've fought anything in this job, and I lost, and 3 weeks later it came back to me anyway, because nobody higher up cared enough to keep arguing over one dead woman's copper disc. I've worn it since. 41 years if you want the number. It doesn't come off easy anymore. The cords fused to the metal from sweat and salt. She died the winter after we found her. Not from anything we did. The medical staff were clear about that, just old, in whatever way her kind measured old. By then the survey had mostly packed up and moved on to the next drowned coastline on the manifest, and I was the only one who'd asked to stay behind an extra rotation, officially to finish the ambient archive, unofficially because I didn't like the idea of her last weeks having no one arrive with the same case at the same hour. I was there when it happened. I had the mic running out of habit, not orders, because by then the assignment had ended and nobody was making me record anything. She made the long sound one more time before she went, the same one from the day she gave me the tag, quieter this time, barely more than breath over the gill slits, and I sat in the standing water beside her because it seemed wrong to be dry when she wasn't. Our linguist, a patient, unglamorous man named Averil Osk, who'd spent 3 years failing to build her a grammar and never once complained about it, sat with the recording side by side and told me, 11 months later, over a bad connection from 2 systems away, that he thought he'd finally cracked 5 characters of it. He said the sound she made both times, the giving and the dying, wasn't a word for goodbye. It was her own name, the one on the tag. She had spent her whole recorded life being catalogued as the last of the Ithier, a designation, a case number with skin, and in the only 2 moments she chose her own sound instead of ours, she told me who she actually was. I still can't say it right. Osk gave me the phonemes years ago, and I've practiced in the dark on nights I don't sleep, and I still land wrong on the second syllable every time, some vowel my mouth wasn't built to make. I used to think that failure meant something had gotten away from me. I don't think that anymore. I think the tag was never asking me to pronounce her correctly. It was asking me to try in front of her, while she could still watch me get it wrong and not turn away. That's the whole story. No last stand, no rescue, no counsel in a marble hall arguing over her fate while I made a speech. Just a woman who was alone under the water for longer than my species has kept written records, and a recordist who showed up with the same case every morning until she trusted the sound of it enough to hand over her name. People ask sometimes why the tag matters more to me than the recordings, which are the actual scientific record, filed and indexed, and available to anyone with clearance who wants to study the last documented voice of the Ithier. I tell them the recordings are for everyone else. The tag is the only thing that was for me specifically, the only object she chose to give rather than simply allow to be taken, in a place where everything else about her, down to the water she sat in, had already been measured, logged, and assigned a case number before I ever crouched down at her eye level. I still wear the tag. I still can't say the word right. Some mornings, before the coffee, before anything else, I put my thumb over the 5 characters I can't read, and I say it anyway, wrong vowel and all, because somewhere in a chamber full of green water, being heard wrong by someone who kept coming back was the last thing she ever chose for herself.